Hello, my name is Rebecca Parento, and I'm going to be presenting today on complex and severe interfering behaviors. And this is going to be through the University of Alaska and the CBAI program with the Center of Human Development. So, this topic can be really intense. I could probably talk about complex interfering behaviors for hours, but I'm really kind of focusing on the nitty-gritty of what you can do in the moment or prior to an episode as antecedent interventions. But our main goal today is really going to be to talk about how we can improve the safety and quality of life for our clients, our children, students, staff members, and family. Family is very important too. The title of this presentation is Severe Complex Behaviors or Interfering Behaviors, and that can mean a lot of things to us. Depending on who you work with, you can see a whole array of unsafe behaviors. And because of this, I wanted to hone on the most popular and what we kind of hear the most about. So I included physical aggression, which can include biting, kicking, punching, hitting, or spitting. Sometimes this can be unwanted sexual contact. I don't get too deep into that in this presentation. I could probably give a whole nother presentation on that. Self-injury, which can look like headbanging, self-hitting, crashing into items, self-biting, self-punching. Elopement, which is pretty common in my field. That's leaving the area, building, or the environment without permission. So maybe you have a kid that keeps running away, or maybe you have a client in a group home that keeps leaving in the middle of the night. That can be really unsafe for those clients. And then severe disruptions kind of carry over into those big, almost behavioral episodes, and they include property destruction, screaming, using slurs, and self-induced vomiting, which I'm not sure if many of you have seen self-induced vomiting, but I've had several clients that have engaged in this, and this can also be a really scary behavior because a lot of times they're doing a lot of work to bring that vomit up, and in that process, they're doing a lot of damage to their throat. Pica is also on this list of behaviors that we're going to be talking about today, and I listed it separately because it's actually out of all of the behaviors that I listed, the most dangerous one because it causes the most death. And that's because the pica is when you are eating inedible objects or objects that can't be digested. So that can be as simple as sticks or bugs, and as serious as lighters, scissors, nails, and things like that. And research shows that pica is the behavior that has the most deaths on record in our field. Another really important factor to consider when you're talking about complex severe behaviors is clients that have a dual diagnosis, so more than one thing going on. Sometimes our clients might not have these severe, really unsafe behaviors, maybe like pica or eloping, but their other medical diagnoses make them very complex. So you could have a client that has autism and cerebral palsy. You can have a client that might have autism and a mental health diagnosis like schizophrenia. There are a lot of intellectual developmental disability diagnoses out there, and you can have several different ones that can all be combined with different medical diagnoses. And then this is the most important one to me, and I could probably write a whole presentation on this as well, but the learning history and the trauma of our clients plays a huge, 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 huge part in the behaviors that we're going to see from them. If we have a client that says maybe has autism and they're unable to communicate sufficiently with others, and they can't express those emotions or that trauma or that learning history that they've had, many times you'll see that they are expressing that trauma in different ways. And I think that because we think oh, well, they don't talk and they can't tell us our feelings. We assume that they have none, and we assume that the trauma didn't impact them like it might impact other people. That's very, very false. And kind of going on with that mentality can make complex behaviors so much harder if you don't address that trauma piece. So, with these really complex clients, it's really important to not go at it alone. Most of the time in my full time job, which is a complex behavior consultant, I am going into homes or group homes or schools where the kids or the adults are really struggling and have more than one specific need. And the cases where I'm the most successful are definitely the cases where there's a big team with lots of professionals at the table that you can kind of bounce ideas off of and collaborate with. As long as you don't have, one professional pushing their way and no other way, you can usually get a really, really strong team. So, in a lot of our cases, depending on what's going on, it's important to have all those stakeholders involved and relatively early if possible. Some of these stakeholders usually include the various therapies that that client might be going to, specialized doctors, primary care doctors, maybe some therapists, some mental health professionals, direct care providers, so DSPs. I think that it's really important to have all of the staff at a meeting for a client, especially if you're talking about changing things or putting an intervention in place that's proactive for safety. Teachers, of course, big big stakeholder family members. So, like the whole family, and then, if you got a grandma that's really involved, she should be there. If you've got an aunt that's really involved, they should be there. And if you have life coaches or maybe even a parole officer, all of these are really important to kind of come to the table and discuss as a team what's going to be best for that client and what can everyone do across all of these different environments to support that client. One of the biggest things I look at when I am deciding to really target a severe interfering behavior is social validity. It's really important to know that when you're targeting this behavior, is it going to improve the client's quality of life? Is it going to do anything? Is reducing this behavior just going to make your job easier and not the client's? Will it improve both of your lives? Will it open up clients' life for new learning opportunities? So, for instance, if I have a client that has a history of disrobing, and I can teach him to reduce his disrobing or to at least keep his clothes on when he's out in the community, by addressing that behavior specifically with a team, I can actually open up a giant door for this guy by allowing him to access the community a lot more. And then, does the client assent or consent to the intervening intervention with the severe interfering behavior? So, whatever you're doing, you need to make sure that your client is not actively resisting what you're doing. It's very important with all of our clients, if they can talk or not, that we are looking at consent and assent for what we're doing with them. And if they are fighting us in this intervention, then it's not the right intervention, and we need to come back to the table and figure out how to address this severe interfering behavior. So, when we start to talk interventions, we really want to kind of aim and address the students at the top peer in this presentation. These severe interfering behaviors are going to be individuals that are at the top of the pyramid that I have on the screen. But my point of this slide is to kind of say, okay, well, we've got these really hard clients with severe interfering behaviors that are really dangerous. They're going to be at the top of our tier and they're going to have some really in depth, individualized plans. However, we can't get to the top until we do all of the things at the bottom tier. And all students, those students that are not exhibiting those interfering behaviors, can also have all of these interventions in place and be helpful. So today, for this presentation, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the preventative antecedent interventions that you can do in your home or your school or out in the community that you can put in place before we start talking about those really individualized plans. Interventions at the bottom tier are for everybody, not even just for our clients. They can be for our toddlers, they can be for our grade school kids, they can be for adults, partners, they can be for coworkers. These are just kind of bottom level interventions that, if you have in place, really reduce the likelihood of a client making it to the top tier. And if they're done consistently, they really make an improvement. You can implement most of the bottom tier interventions in different environments. So you can do it in the classroom, you can do it at home, you can do it when you're at grandma's, you can do it when you're at the community. If a kid's on dayhab, you can do a lot of these little interventions. They do not take a lot of effort to implement, but they do take some effort to implement consistently across settings when there's lots of providers. So, almost all of the interventions that we're going to talk about today are antecedent interventions, which means they come before the behavior of concern even happens. So, we're doing things to the environment or we're doing things with that client to reduce the chances of that behavior even happening in the future. The next couple slides are going to talk about the tier 1 positive practices that you can implement in any environment and will systematically reduce the occurrence of some of those severe interfering behaviors that we're seeing. So the first one, and I use this one all the time, all day long, with my clients or with my kids or with my husband. I do a lot of pre-teaching and pre-corrects. So when I wake up in the morning, one of the first things I do with my family is sit down and talk about the schedules for that day, what's happening for that day, what expectations should my husband know, what expectations should my son know. Usually there's some ride stuff in there, but we go through the schedule every day so that everyone knows what to expect and isn't surprised if, they forgot about a doctor's appointment or didn't know they had a test. This is the same thing for all our clients in group homes or in schools. If you have a kid at school that hates crowds and loud noises, but they have to go to the gym for some type of assembly at school, that teacher should be pre-teaching that student almost several times before the meeting actually happens, what's going to happen, where they're going to be sitting, how long they're going to be sitting for, and what they get to do right after, which, if it's a tough task, should be something reinforcing. For example, if you have a client that hates showering, when he gets out of the shower, he should know that he earns his favorite pop. Or if you have a client that won't get dressed and they have a doctor's appointment, if you let them know that their schedule is to get dressed, eat breakfast, go to the doctor's, and maybe then go to the park, they're going to know that if they can get through those harder moments, it's going to pay off at the end because they're getting something that's really reinforcing. Um, Specific praise statements are also really important. And when I was younger in the field, I used to think that this was kind of baloney. They know when I'm praising them because I'm physically touching them and I'm doing those things too. I'm rubbing their head or squeezing their shoulders. Um, but it really, really helps to be very descriptive in what you're praising so they know exactly what you like. So, for instance, wow, I love the way you helped your friend find their pencil, or I love how neat your handwriting is. When I work with younger kids, I feel like I go back over and over again. Wow, I love how you're sitting in your seat. Wow, I love that you've been working and sitting in your seat for more than 3 minutes. Um, I used to have a kid on a timer that every 30 seconds, if he was still sitting in his seat, I would also deliver praise statements. Wow, you're still sitting in your seat. I love that. It can be scattered throughout the day, in between programming, in between lessons, but it's really important to point out exactly what your clients or your family members or your students are doing well. Another important one is environment expectations. So this is also very important. This is probably the most important to me. If you have a student that engages in unsafe behaviors where they might be hurting themselves or maybe even hurting them others, improving the environment to make it safe to a conducive working and learning place, a place where they feel safe, can really reduce that risk of them getting injured or others getting injured. There are three more Tier 1 positive practices that I wanted to go over. Physical proximity to clients is very important. I am currently working with a client who likes to go out into the community. He loves it actually, but he really also likes hitting people, kind of on the chest, so it makes that like loud slapping sound. It doesn't necessarily hurt, but it could definitely startle a stranger if they're not expecting it and they're in the store. So currently, right now, I'm working with a DSP, and we go on a couple community trips a week, and we practice one, his physical proximity to other customers in the store, as well as our physical proximity to him and other clients. So we kind of know when he sees someone out of like the side of his eye that he's likely probably going to try to hit them. And so I'm working really hard with this DSP to position ourselves on either side of this client while he pushes the cart, but allows us to kind of like have our hand towards the back if he was to turn around and run off, and also limits him to being able to run from side to side. When we are in busy aisles, I make sure that there's always an adult between him and another adult. And typically, uh, we are really trying to use our physical proximity to him to ensure the safety of others. We've been doing this for a few months now. He was very successful at hitting clients the first few times we went on community trips, but now he's becoming very good at not hitting, or we've become very good at our physical proximity. But also, when we leave the store, we have one of the workers give him a very hard high five as he's leaving so that he does get that kind of stimulus input, but he gets it in a way that is socially acceptable and safe. So, physical proximity is a good one. If you have an eloper, physical proximity is really important because, you know, if you're walking down the hallway in a hospital, you're going to want to make sure that you're walking on the side where the exit is, or um, if you're at Walmart and you have a client that has a history of running off, like you're going to make sure that you're in the middle of the store and all of the big entrances are far away until you're actually ready to leave. So physical proximity is very important, but it does take a little time to master. And it's a good practice to do with any of your complex interfering behavior clients. Um, Frequent social interactions and choices. Just interact with your guys. Even if you don't think they know what you're saying, they do know that you're interacting with them. They see your facial expressions, they hear your voice, they know that you're engaging with them. So those social interactions should be positive. There should be a smile on your face. Um, you should look engaged. You should have rapport with your client. You should be doing things that they want to do together. And those social interactions will really make them feel safe, and they'll trust you more when you are asking them to do things that they may not want to do. Choices are very important as well. A lot of our clients, especially our complex clients, we have to control a lot of their day. And it's really important to give them the control when you can. Giving them choices is the easiest way to do this. The choices can be silly sometimes, or the choices can be choices that we make every day. So I have a student that currently has choices built in throughout his day. And so he gets to choose if he does like a blue worksheet or a red worksheet, if he gets to use the pink pencil or the red pencil. A lot of little tiny choices that he's able to make throughout the day to improve his independence. In a group home and in at home too. I think a good way of doing this as well is to use a schedule and letting the learner or the client manipulate the schedule as much as possible. So often, if I know I'm in a group home and this client has to do these three things while I am there, I'm going to put those three things on the schedule. But then the other three things, I'm probably going to let him pick. It could be leisure items, it could be a snack, it could be playing outside. But I want him to be able to have some of those choices in his schedule so that some of his life is his. And that ownership can really reduce behaviors too. Um, Environment-wide reinforcement. If you're going to be working with a client that's got some really complex behaviors, you got to have an environment they're going to want to be in. If it's an environment that they're just not jiving with, say, it's too overstimulating, there's music or not good shades on the windows, or um, lots of different things that a client might not like, having it in that group home, it's not asking for problems, but it's not going to make the client want to be with you, which will make those unsafe behaviors more of a chance. So really having an environment that gives the client access to things they like food, movies, music, toys, games, is very important because everybody needs reinforcement in things that they like doing in their environment, in their home. Being forced into an environment where there are none of those things don't help our students or our clients succeed. So our severe interfering behavior guys are typically going to be in that third tier, so at the top of the pyramid. But I want to push a point across saying that sometimes the reasons that these clients, learners, guys make it to the third tier may not be due to the behaviors themselves. Sometimes, more often than you probably think, it may simply be more about the environment that the client is in, and that environment is unsafe according to the needs of those clients. Before putting together this presentation, I wanted to brush up and see if there was any more research out there on severe interfering behaviors and kind of how we work with these clients. And I found a presentation, and there was one slide in that presentation that I took like all the way home and meant like so much to me, and that was this slide. Sometimes behaviors wouldn't be so dangerous if the environment were simply different. So, changing the environment can ensure safety and avoid injuries for client and staff. Removing or changing objects of potential harm can avoid unsafe, complex behaviors to begin with. That doesn't mean that we're going to be able to avoid everything, but if we can control the environment, we have way more control over those really unsafe behaviors. And although I see in some classrooms it's hard to change the environment because that child isn't the only kid in that environment. And so you can only make so many changes, but there are many, many ways to make an environment more conducive for that client. Um, a lot of the clients that I have in group homes that have some complex behaviors that include aggression and self-injury, they often will have a room in their house that we call like a low sensory room. It's got bean bags and padded walls and a padded floor. So if that behavior did, if we did see that behavior, we have a place to manage it safely. And also when we see precursor behavior to that unsafe, maybe self-injurious behavior, we are able to have that client in that safer environment before we actually have the behavior occur. Skills often taught to decrease the unsafe behaviors. This is a short list, but I want to say it's a very complicated list. And some of these skills are very important, but depending on the client, can be really hard to teach. And the younger they're kind of exposed to that teaching, the better. So a lot of times I have adult clients that don't have these skills, and teaching these skills is possible, but it takes a lot of fidelity and consistency across settings from providers. So the first one is a communication response, any type of communication response where they can tell us they're in pain or they need a break. That communication response doesn't have to be like, I want the blue toothpaste. It can simply be tapping a card to let us know that they're dysregulated or they need to go lay down or they're upset about something. Teaching clients how to wait or tolerate something that's unavailable is a really good skill to teach. Also takes a long time. And then for those rigid clients that have to stick to a schedule and need everything to be the same or a certain way, you can also teach that flexibility. The more skills we teach, especially the earlier on we are, the more access to the world these clients are going to get. I wanted to really push home in this presentation that there is no right process when it comes to these complicated cases. Sometimes it takes more than one try. If it's not effective, then you try again. So we might try an intervention, it might not work, so we'll try something else. Sometimes it takes time to make a client's world bigger. So the process is right for your client if it's safe and respectful, it demonstrates a clear effectiveness, so it has to actually work, which is important. We can put something in place and it not work. And it makes the client's world bigger at the end rather than smaller. And keeping that in mind as you're working with your clients every day, whether it's a student at a school, your child at home, or a DSP at a group home, if what you're doing is making the client's world bigger and not smaller, then you're on the right track. Before I start discussing this slide, I really wanted to push home the antecedent portion of this presentation. We do the best work in preventing these unsafe behaviors when we have a lot of antecedent interventions in place. The remaining slides on this presentation are going to be more for what happens when you're in the moment, but I can tell you right now, if you haven't done any of the antecedent stuff and now you're in the moment, it's going to be a lot messier and you're going to be in the moment a lot more. So this is a client in crisis safety flowchart. So the first one says, I have a client in crisis right now. Then straight from there, you want to make the environment safer. You want to address aggression by getting away or possibly having people block. Consider maybe some safety clothing. If they're a biter, you might need some arm guards. Stay a distance away if they're headbangers. And can you turn off the behavior? If there is one thing in the moment right now to stop Bobby's headbanging, what would do it? How do I turn off the behavior? So in a crisis, that is where your head should be at. This flow chart right here. So examples of making the environment safer include removing unsafe objects, covering unsafe objects and surfaces, closing doors, removing people, or making a padded room. I wanted to push a little bit more with DSPs working in group homes. Unsafe objects can be a lot of things, but typically when I go into a group home and I know a client has some pretty serious behaviors, I am automatically going to want to know, are knives locked up? Are all of like the under the sink chemicals locked up? Are medicines locked up, which by law they should be. And maybe some other things need to be locked up just because they can use them in unsafe ways. After a big event, it's really important to debrief and then have an intervention plan for the next time this might happen. You want to meet with the team and stakeholders in this case to create a plan to address the problem, and it may include outside professionals. So, typically, in my job as a complex behavioral consultant, oftentimes might be when I get pulled in when things are really unsafe and they're not sure how to make it safer or make the behavior reduce so that it's not happening so often. Um, Debriefing in detail to others on the team can help create a plan to avoid the situation in the future. So, if I'm on a case and I have a client who had a very bad self injurious aggression episode, I want to know about that as a stakeholder in the case. I want to know about that. And the DSPs and the managers at that house or the parents should be pulling a meeting so that we can say, this is what happened. How do we avoid it in the future? Debriefing can also help with your staff significantly. A lot of stuff can go down during episodes like that. Staff do get secondary trauma, which we don't talk about very often. But debriefing about these episodes, talking them through it, and having a plan for next time it happens is very, very important. It not only helps the client, but it helps the staff kind of get in the good headspace and feel safe again. So, this slide is going to talk about some steps to creating safe physical spaces. I have worked in the field in quite some time. I have seen the oddest things used as weapons, and I've seen some traditional things used as weapons. So I have a very trained eye in knowing what they might use in a situation. And it makes me pretty good at walking into situations and figuring out what needs to change. But basically, that's only because I've probably had 500 different projectiles thrown at me over the years. So, with that, keep in mind that objects can be used as projectiles. So, stuff's going in the air if it's around and it's not locked up. If you have stuff on the tables or you have, stuff on the coffee table or on the kitchen counters, and your client is not in a safe place to engage in these behaviors, they are going to use those things as projectiles. So I often say that if you have a complex behavior client in a group home, you need to be really aware of what you have out at all times. A lot of stuff should be used and then put back in a excuse me, put back in a cabinet or a locker of some kind where it can't be used or reached. Is the area clear of small objects that can be thrown or could be stepped on? I find this is much more of a problem with our younger clients, or our clients that are in school. Legos are awful. If you need to be physically managing a client and you have Legos all over the floor, I promise you, you're not going to be happy. So you want to make sure that the space itself has a clear floor, that you're not tripping over stuff, that your legs aren't getting caught on chairs or anything like that. Um, are there other clients around that may not be able to protect themselves? So this is a big one. So if you're working in a group home, it may be the fact that you have to move all the other clients to a different room and close the door. It may be an episode where the client is in the main room in the house and everyone has to leave. Maybe you go sit in cars. I have seen it happen. In classrooms, they clear out kids quite often because in classrooms, that's where I find you can't lock everything up. And no matter what, they're small children and they leave stuff out. So things will be available to throw. Um, and then, is the client in a position where staff can back away for safety? This is a big one. If you don't have to put hands on, don't put hands on. You're only creating more trauma for that client in that moment. If you can safely back away, you should safely back away. The only time I am actively telling people not to safely back away is if I think that the safety is greatly, greatly impacted by that client, and we need to keep them safe. If they're acting in self-injury that's not going to cause any serious damage, then I am going to let them continue to tantrum and have my staff back off. This isn't always the case. There are different intervention plans out there that do different things, but if a client is in a position where staff can back safely away, they should 100% do it every single time. This is just a reminder slide. We talked about most of this a few slides ago, but just wanted to push it home. So go-to recommendations for crisis cases. So remember to walk between a client and a potential target of the behavior. So, you know, if a if a client is targeting another resident or another student, you'll need to walk in between them. If you have an eloper in a school or out in the community, you need to be able to make sure that you know where all the exits are at a restaurant, maybe where a back exit is. Um, and if you are out, you do have an eloper, you want to place yourself between any of those main doors and the client so that you are one step ahead of that elopement. And then, does the client interact with materials that could potentially hurt themselves if they were upset? If this is a yes, then we need to be really careful. And these materials they might need to engage with at times, whether it be schoolwork or whether it be a leisure program. But then it's important to know what precursor behaviors look like. So, precursor behaviors are kind of like the early warning signs of the severe complex behavior that we've been talking about. So sometimes you'll see a client that might like clench their fists or take their hands and bump their chin, or they might stop talking, or they look down, or they have a scowl on their face and they furrow their brows and they start making these grunting noises. All of these things can kind of be like the tall tale signs of that complex behavior that we're trying to avoid. So if you have a client that's potentially working with materials that they could hurt themselves with, as soon as you see these first signs of a possible episode, you need to remove those items. So with older clients, I kind of always lean against holding hands unless they're a large, large eloper and you are out in the community. However, some of our younger clients, for various reasons, still need to hold hands while they're in the hallway or while they're outside, while they're walking in the parking lot. Um, if a client wants or needs their hand to be held, do we hold it underneath or do we hold it over? So this is just kind of another helpful pointer if you have some elopers that you're working with. So holding their hand under tends to work better with clients who bite or aggress because your arm's underneath, so you can pull away if they try to grab you to bite. You can just pull down. And also, you can kind of pull that arm down and step back if they're going to aggress. It kind of gives you more leverage. But if you hold a hand overhand, it works better with clients who engage in self-injury. So I'm probably gonna hold underneath a client's hands if they're very aggressive and they like to scratch and bite. Whereas if I'm working with a client who would rather scratch and bite themselves, I'm going to hold over their hands because I'm able to block that attempt at self-injury because my hand is between, their mouth and their other body parts. So I can block that self-injury. So when you're in the moment, when you're in crisis and you're trying to change the environment in that moment because you know that that's probably going to be your best bet to stop a behavior, there are some tips for preventing harm and making a safe environment. So avoiding environments they really dislike is important. So if you have a student at school and they're having a really hard time and they absolutely hate the nurse's office, the last place you probably want to bring them is the nurse's office. It may mean the removal of all demands. 100% most of the time, for a time during that episode and after, there should be a removal of all demands. Likely that is going to significantly reduce the episode duration. And you want, at that point, you want the complex interfering behavior to stop. So, how do you turn it off? Removing all demands and directions is going to be at least one way to do that. You also want to maintain clear and consistent communication with other team members and professionals and staff. So, if you are changing an environment for that client, you better make sure everyone on that team knows why you changed the environment, and that environment change it or stays changed across settings consistently. Maintaining safety through these episodes is also very important, and you can't do that without several things. You need to have a clear and efficient plan that everyone is trained on, all of the people that are working with that client, whether it be in school or at a group home or at a community center. Everyone needs to kind of know what's going on and how things are treated. Why? Because consistency is key. If what you're being consistent on is effective and it's across all the settings, it's going to be very, very important. Consistency has kind of been a little bit of a theme that I keep coming back to during this presentation, but having those team meetings and talking about the importance of running the plan with fidelity and with consistency is really important. However, consistency is not important if what you are doing is not effective. And that's also important to kind of bring to the table. I've been a BCBA for almost 20 years now. No, it has been 20 years. And I can definitely say that consistency is extremely important, but plans don't always work. My plans don't always work. And if they don't work, we just rewrite them and try again. But it's important to step back and say, okay, I'm doing these things, but is it effective? Because if we're putting these interventions in place and they're not effective, it could be at the cost of our client. And then maintaining safety, just always think about that environment. Continue to create a safe environment where that client would have a really hard time hurting themselves or others. It's also really important to avoid blame in this process. I think everyone that has a complex client with some serious interfering behaviors knows that it can be a very stressful situation. There are a lot of team players, and a lot of emotions can kind of be evoked when working in these really high stress, high anxiety situations. And it's really easy to blame. So during this whole process, it can be easy to blame, whether it be the client, the staff, family, or other stakeholders. But we ain't getting nowhere if we are blaming people or we're blaming the client. The client is not the problem. The client is never the problem. So really, we just need to throw that blame in the trash, because as good DSPs and teachers and parents and caregivers that are working with these clients, if they're not being successful, it's usually something that we're not doing right. All right, well, I'm really glad that you guys came to listen to me today. This slide is the resources and citations that I used in this presentation. One was actually another presentation that I watched recently. It was called Help, We Can't Wait for the Behavior Plan, Creating Immediate Safety for Students. It's from Learning Behavior Analysis, and it was presented by Cecilia Sigod and Patrick Jeckman. I also used a lot of information from the Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. There's one article that focused on state implementation and scaling up evidence-based practices in a multi-tiered system and support research network for schools. This was from 2022 in October. Also, I used another article from 2022 from the Center on PBIS called "What Does Research Say About the Effect of Tier 1 PBIS for Students with Disabilities?" This was used a lot when I talked about the Tier 1 interventions as well as the pyramid that I showed you guys. And then the last resource I had was also from the Center on PBIS, and it was actually published in 2023. It's called Implementing Physical Safety Measures Effectively in Schools from the University of Oregon. I just want to thank you again for coming to this presentation and taking the time out of your day to listen to me. If you have any questions or comments, or if you would like some links to some of the resources that I used, please let me know. My email is reparento, PARENTEAU, @alaska.edu. Thank you.